Hello, everybody. Please make sure that your microphones are on mute as you come into the call. It can be difficult to get around that feedback. All right, and it's time to get started. And my colleague Catherine will continue allowing people in as they come into the waiting room. In the meantime, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this fine Thursday as we hear from Dan Jaffe Wilder about building resilient landscapes. Before I introduce Dan, I'm going to sneeze. Nope, it went away. A few ELA housekeeping items. ELA members and non-members alike are warmly invited to join us for any and all of our fall events. Register at ecolandscaping.org for any of these fun and educational experiences. Join us again 1 week from today for the highly anticipated Season's End Summit in Tower Hill, Massachusetts. ELA is also hosting an eco tour at Greenwood Cemetery this Saturday, October 21st, and those who follow us on Instagram will certainly know. The 2023 Regenerative Solutions for Resilient Landscapes Conference is coming up quickly. Register today for this event on November 9th. Whew. Okay, maybe a little more than a few. Thank you all for your patience, and please feel free to email any ELA personnel with any inquiries. Lastly, please complete the survey link in the chat at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Dan Jaffe Wilder. Dan Jaffe Wilder has 15 plus years experience in ecological horticulture. This includes experience in propagation of native species as a photographer and author of Native Plants for New England Gardens, a teacher and lecturer of numerous topics, including pollinators, sustainable landscape practices, foraging, and cultivation of edible species, low maintenance horticulture, and others. Dan is the Director of Applied Ecology at Norcross Wildlife Foundation in Wales, Massachusetts, and its 8,000-acre sanctuary. He is also on the board of directors of ELA and is passionate about ecological practices and finding better ways to support landscape stewardship. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Aviva. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Special shout out to ELA. This is a phenomenal organization. If this is the first introduction for anyone, check out the website. It's full of all sorts of good stuff. So without further ado, tonight is Building Resilient Landscapes. This is a lecture I've been doing for a little while, but honestly, this is probably the lecture that has changed the most since its first inception and up to today. This was actually just completely revamped a couple of weeks ago, so it's a little more. Today, it's really about building resiliency into the landscapes. It's aimed at kind of the general, person. I've got a version of this that is specifically aimed at landscape professionals for larger landscapes. We're talking acres. Today is really more about, not that there's not a lot of use you could go in there, but this is about what you might be able to do at home, or if you are a landscaper, what you might be able to do at a client in a more residential setting. So without further ado, let's just jump into it, because this is also a lecture where I'm covering topics today to one extent or another briefly, because each one of them could be a 2-hour talk, and we don't have 9 hours today, so we're doing the hour version. So know that there's just we're going to do some introductions, I'm going to give you some details, and there's just so much more we could talk about at future times. So we're going to talk about why we work with native plants, and part of that is talking about what we actually mean by native. It's not nearly as simple as I first thought it was when I started learning native. It's also a constantly changing definition, which is kind of reflective of new information as it comes along. We'll talk today about weeds, specifically how to deal with them. And we're going to kind of break that down into this section on living mulch and a section on seed, and how seed can be either a weed problem on the landscape or how seed can be an ally on the landscape, depending on what plants you're working with. I don't think I have a lecture these days that doesn't involve me telling people to kill their lawn, at least to some extent. I've got an entire 4-hour lecture on kill your lawn. Today is not that, but it will definitely introduce some really important concepts and give you some good ideas for ways you might want to relook at your lawn. And then I'm going to have a section on native plants for any landscape. It's a pretty short section, but it comes with a list. The list is available. I believe I sent it out to the ELA managers. So if you don't already have it, we will get it to you shortly. And if you don't get it shortly, just shoot us an email and say, I'm looking for that list. And we'll talk about that as we get to it. Finally, we're going to talk about garden cleanup. Seems fitting this time of year. I actually added that specifically for this kind of fall section of this class. We're going to talk about what to do and more so what not to do. So let's start with doom and gloom. I hate to start off on a paranoid note, but it's better than ending on one. So things aren't going all that well in the world these days in terms of biodiversity. We are in what many scientists are calling a biodiversity crisis. We're looking at substantial insect decline, and this is a worldwide issue that is reflected here in America as much as it is in plenty of other places. We're looking at songbird declines, something that is directly related to insects, although it's not that everything here is in insect decline affecting birds, but it is a major part of the problem. We've seen 68 vertebrate species go extinct in the past 50 years. These are big numbers. These are scary numbers. And we lose what amounts to the size of Greece every year in forests, which is a major problem. So oftentimes when people hear these numbers, they think of places other than America. We think about rainforest clearing, and we might think about South America, or we think about insect decline, and that came out of a study to a large extent in Germany. We might think about Europe. Massachusetts is my home state. Massachusetts actually does pretty good. We've got pretty solid environmental laws in Massachusetts, and yet we are still losing 25,000 acres to development in the past 5 years. That in itself is not, the problem. I cannot say that we should just stop development. That's not a realistic statement. But I do want us to develop smartly. And when I see that we've lost 9,300 acres of high priority conservation land, that is not smart development. That is, if anything, dumb development. That's the sort of development I do want to see stopped. Let's talk about developing the areas that are better developed and protecting those areas that need to be protected. So with doom and gloom, I always like to talk about what we can actually do about these problems. So what do we do about, habitat loss? And there's kind of two ends of this. There's the local and there's the global. When we start talking about global, or at least regional, I talk about land conservation. And that means getting to know your local land trusts, getting to know your local kind of land conservation organizations. For me, it's Mass Audubon, but there's likely an Audubon chapter pretty much probably where everyone on this call is kind of coming from. The Nature Conservancy is a fantastic organization. In my area, we've got the Trustees of Reservations, which are kind of like a land trust plus. Getting to know your local land trust is often the first direct route that I go, because that really kind of protects land right in your backyard, which is really nice. And then getting even smaller scale, build local habitat. And that means planting native plants. And if we want to keep it really, really simple, you're welcome to sign off this call in about 30 seconds, go home and say, you know what, I'm just going to plant native plants, and say that you're doing good stuff. We can get really specific and talk about sundial lupin and Carter butterflies or Baltimore checker spots and chelonis, or we can just say plant native plants. And that will do a lot of good, no matter how you define native, which we'll get to in a moment. So let's start looking at what we mean by native. This is the tale of two geraniums. On the left, we've got the garden geranium. This is the common annual plant you can find in just about any nursery that you'll go to. They bloom very nicely. They bloom all season long, generally. People love this plant. It's not a native species. On the right side, we've got the wild geranium. This is a native species, Geranium maculatum, a true geranium, if that means anything. And when we start looking at who's interacting with these plants, that's where things start getting really interesting. They are both fed upon by the European honeybee. The European honeybee, if it's not already obvious, is from Europe. This is not a native species, but this is a very common pollinator, especially in agricultural operations. This is the bee that forms, honeybee colonies and hives and can be traveled around on trucks or raised in your backyard. It's a non-native species. It's got some pollination value. There's some interesting questions as to how this bee affects our native bees. This is Bombus impatiens. This is the most common native bumblebee, at least in my region, and probably in most of the folks' regions who are listening to this today. This is the ultimate generalist and will feed on just about any flower it can get to, and it will feed on either one of these geraniums the same way the European honeybee will. Unfortunately, this is where that non-native geranium kind of ends. It will never feed the mining bees. The andrinas are specialized. Some of them very special and some of them a little less so, but they're not going to feed on a non-native annual species. Nor will the noble sun moth, whose caterpillar will eat the leaves of Geranium maculatum, the white-lined sphinx moth, the purple-lined sun moth, the white-marked tussock moth, about 27 other species of butterflies and moths, and all these specialized bees and bee-mimic flies and beetles and all this life. And that's kind of the power of native plants. They feed a lot of life. And the moral of the story is not don't plant garden geranium. If anything, it would be don't make your entire landscape garden geranium. But this plant on the left is not an invasive species. It's not causing any harm. I hate to be the soapbox preacher, so what I'm not going to do is tell you not to plant it. What I'm going to do is say, try and make the majority of your landscape native plants. And if you happen to really like garden geraniums and you want to plant them in amongst a dominated native plant ecosystem, you're doing just fine. Still a fine plant to stick in a pot and put on your porch. There's some other reasons why I really like native species. First off, there's a ton of them. If we start looking at kind of the Northeast as a region, we've got about 2,500 species of native plants, and these things grow absolutely everywhere. So this plant, Diapensia lapponica, the pincushion plant, grows on the top of Mount Washington. So conditions up there are, depending on the day, up to about 200-mile-per-hour winds. This grows in about 1/8 of an inch of gravel in rocks. It handles crazy temperature fluctuations. This is a survivor. This plant is a horrible choice as a garden plant, but it is definitely the epitome of a specialized native species that can grow where very few other things do. You want to see this one, you need to get up into the Krumholtz, if not the true alpine zone. You're going way up high. It does not grow down low. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got this green slime, which is actually a fern. This is the Appalachian bristle fern. This thing grows in such dark environments that nothing else can grow there, and so it doesn't have to compete with anything. It grows in caves and under rocks. It's actually thought that this thing might be dispersed by porcupines, which is just amazing to think we have porcupine dispersed plants in our region. We're learning more about our flora pretty much every day. Now, neither one of these plants are great garden plants. That being said, we have great garden plants that will grow in very extreme situations. Yellow plume grass, this is a plant that was previously known as Indian grass, Sorghastrum nudens. This thing will grow in full sun, dry soils, absolutely no organic matter, no nutrients, just pure sand, gravel, grit, sort of full blazing sun sites. And while it does that, it looks absolutely phenomenal. This picture is probably for right about this time of year. This was a picture I took last year, but you can see that orange kind of red color starting to show up on the foliage itself. Those golden, in this case, we're in the fruiting stage. When it's in flower, it's a little more plumy, hence plume grass. And at this point, it gets into that just kind of, I don't know, golden seed grass, whatever we might want to call it. And then we've got something like maple leaf viburnum, which is our Appalachian bristle fern garden plant. This plant will grow in dense shade, much more so than a lot of other species. It's an absolutely phenomenal plant for fall foliage. It's one of those species that produces really nice fall foliage, even in dense shade. You'll find a lot of plants that produce really good fall foliage, really show off when they've got good light, but you give them too much shade and it just kind of goes maybe yellow or green and then just goes away for the fall. This plant will show off in the darkest of spots. And the idea here is that when we're picking, the right native plant for the right site, we have to do a lot less on the landscape. We don't have to water them as much. We definitely don't need to fertilize them. And in most cases, we don't need to mow them. There's exceptions to all these rules. I always stick my mostly in there just so that if someone wants to say, I got an example, yeah, there's plenty of them out there. But in general, less inputs, more life. This is the Baltimore checker spot. What we're looking at here is the chrysalis. There was a caterpillar in there. The butterfly already exited. This thing was empty by the time I found it. And it is hosting on Chelone glabra, the white turtlehead. This is a very specialized interaction. The Baltimore checker spot hosts on Chelone glabra, the white turtlehead. It does not host on really anything else, including the pink turtlehead, which is native to Pennsylvania. And yet that animal, the Baltimore checker spot, will not host on it. It needs the white turtlehead. Very specialized. Most of the time, our specialization is to the genus level, as in turtle heads. But we've got an instance here where it's down to a species level, which is less common, but by no means rare. So here's the million-dollar question. What do we mean by native? I could ramble on about this for hours, and at the end, I'll tell you we don't have an answer. What we have is information, and we are constantly updating and learning more. There are, depending on who you're talking to, there's thousands of definitions of native. Maybe not thousands, but definitely dozens. When I first started working at Garden in the Woods, we were defining native based on the states of New England. At one point, we said, why are we defining native based on political lines? State lines, plants don't care. So we started defining it based on the ecoregions of New England. Now that I'm at Norcross, we've got a different definition. What I often kind of get into when people start arguing as to whether or not, say, coneflower is native is I come down to, do we really care? What is the goal? Is the goal to plant a plant that might have existed before you? Or is the goal to plant a plant that'll build habitat in the ecosystem, which is what a lot of native plant, kind of planters are looking for. In which case you can kind of say, I really don't care if it's native by, kind of this line or that line. What I care about is a plant that does this on the ecosystem. And I will jokingly call it native enough. And that tends to be where we come down at Norcross. A lot of time it's like, how are we building habitat? With native plants. What do we mean by native? Well, plants that build habitat. We're not the first ones to do this. Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark wrote a book in, I think it was 2013, called The Living Landscape, where they redefine native based entirely on ecological interactions. They've got a whole paragraph on it, but within that paragraph is this line calling for complex and essential relationships, which is a really good way of looking at what we mean by native, or at least what we mean by habitat. This picture here is this caterpillar here, I think, is in the running for the cutest caterpillar in New England. This is the spicebush swallowtail. You find this one hosting on spicebush and sassafras, and that's it. A highly specialized insect, and that is a complex and essential relationship. So I like throwing numbers at things, helps me to kind of think about things from a different angle. So let's start looking at some plants and what they do on the landscape. And we're working with Doug Tallamy's numbers here. So this is going to be Lepidoptera supported. And what that means is we've got a caterpillar eating a leaf of one of these plants. So 2 species that are native, no matter how you define native. Black willow, Salix nigra. This is a generally common willow tree that you will find in the Northeast region. It's a lovely species, definitely underutilized on the landscape. Excuse me. Supports 399 Lepidoptera. That number is based on my region, so Brimfield, Massachusetts. That is a wildly respectable number. Almost 400 species supported by a single species of plant. Fantastic. Throw the fact that willows produce a bunch of pollen for early season bees and all these other kind of things. Oh my God, we ought to grow more of this plant. In the realm of, kind of who is supporting who, bigger is better. The woody plants are often the most supportive plants on the landscape. And as you start getting into the herbaceous spectrum, you'll find that the numbers kind of drop. So with that in mind, wild strawberry supporting 87 species is wildly respectable. When we start looking at herbaceous plants and how many species of Lepidoptera they support, there's only one genus that outcompetes wild strawberry, and that's the goldenrods. Other than goldenrods, wild strawberry is supporting more species than any other single genus in our region. That's a good argument to plant more strawberries. The fact that they taste good is just a secondary bonus for us. So this is where things start to get a little more interesting. Monarda fistinosa. This is a native plant. Again, doesn't matter what definition you're following, whether it be state and time or time and place or state and European colonization or ecosystem function. Monarda fistinosa is native, yet it only supports 11 different Lepidoptera. Numbers are starting to shrink. This tells us a few different things, or maybe it hints at a few different things. First off, I want to point out that these numbers are Lepidoptera supported. So this picture doesn't mean a darn thing. I'm not seeing a caterpillar on this. This is not a support thing. So what is missing from these numbers are, say, something such as bee value. We've been doing some really interesting bee research at Norcross recently, mostly just going from one plant to the next and seeing what plant is supporting the highest diversity of bees and the greatest number of bees. And guess which one has won 3 years in a row? It's Monarda fistulosa. So keep in mind that these Doug Tallamy numbers are phenomenally valuable information, but they don't tell the whole story. But then we get to something like red Trillium erectum. This supports 2 Lepidoptera. As far as we can tell, it doesn't really support a lot of bees, and the ones it supports are very generalist. The Lepidoptera that are feeding on red Trillium are not specialized. So what is this telling us? Maybe trilliums don't really matter in the environment. Maybe we don't know the whole story. Maybe it's a piece of both of those. There's always more to learn. And I'm not going to say that we should ignore the trilliums, but I am going to say that if you're trying to plant an ecosystem that's going to be as viable, as ecologically kind of powerful as possible, I would go for wild bergamot and wild strawberry before I start filling it with trillium. Now let's look at some gray zone plants, because I think the gray zone is where things get really interesting. Sweet crabapple is not native to New England by state lines or political boundaries. When I first started working at New England Wildflower Society at the time, now Native Plant Trust, we would have called this a non-native plant. And yet this plant supports 293 Lepidoptera. And remember, these numbers are coming from Brimfield, Massachusetts, so right here in New England. That is interesting. What we've got here is a plant that is not native by a lot of definitions that supports more life in this region than a lot of native plants do by those same definitions. And that tells me that, either we need to relook at what we mean by native, or we need to say that our goal is habitat, and that's what we're trying to do. And it must be absolutely native by a kind of really stringent definition, I think needs to be a little bit more relaxed. Is that going to be my excuse to plant any plant from, say, Virginia or Florida or Texas? No, definitely not. These numbers still need to play themselves out. But it does mean that I'm willing to look at a bit of a broader range when I start saying what is going to support the greatest life on the landscape. In 90% of the instances, it's a plant that's native to New England by the standard definition, probably 95% of the instances. Still think you should be planting plants that are pretty much native to your area. But I wouldn't be as restrictive as I first thought I needed to be when I got into this. Let's look at some other odd examples. St. John's wort, the shrubby St. John's wort specifically, Hypericum prolificum. You can see the range map there on the right. For those of you who don't know Bonap, that bright green is native and common. That yellow is native and rare, and that kind of teal color you can see up in New England means naturalized, as in it's growing there, but it's not considered native by the Bonap definition. This supports 22 different species of Lepidoptera here in New England. It also is a hugely valuable bee plant. So whether or not you want to say that's not native, I'm not willing to plant, it is a choice you can definitely make. But you definitely can't say it's not a valuable plant in the ecosystem. Now let's look at some solidly non-native plants. These are non-native no matter how you define things. Ginkgo, fascinating tree, supports 1 Lepidoptera in our region. It's a generalist. Boxwood supports 0. Forsythia supports 0. Butterfly bush supports 0 caterpillars. That's one that always needs to be said twice. 0 caterpillars on the butterfly bush. I think Doug Talamay described that one as empty calories. It'll attract a whole bunch of generalist, kind of adult visitors, but it does nothing for them during the specialized portion of their lifespan when they really need the help. It's also hitting invasive species lists in New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and pretty much every state south of us. In fact, Forsythia was just listed as invasive in New Jersey. So it's one that we're starting to look at a little bit differently than we used to. Okay, let's get off what we mean by native, because I can ramble on about that for another 5 hours. Here's a question for everyone in the audience. How many people got into gardening for love of mulch? I've yet to find anyone who said that they got into gardening for love of mulch, and yet when I go online and type in garden, I get pictures like this. And there is more mulch in these gardens than there are plants. And this is not by any means uncommon on the landscape. We see this all over the place. Every one of my neighbor's properties looks like this, if it doesn't look just wild and unkempt, which is not bad, actually. This picture here is what I did when I first got into the landscaping industry. I planted invasive species, I pruned them into meatballs and rocket chips, and I surrounded them in red mulch. I learned what not to do before I learned what to do. These are mulch gardens, and ecologically, these things are sterile. This is not a garden. This is a site at Norcross. This is on the north side of a building. This gets 0 hours of direct sunlight. The soil is horribly compacted, and we have a thriving population of white wood aster there. Not a half bad, planting naturally or just growth for a site that is, by many definitions, a problem site. This is on Martha's Vineyard. This is at the Edgartown Public Library. For anyone who's not familiar with it, Martha's Vineyard is a giant pile of sand off the coast of Massachusetts. They deal with just extremely sandy soils, salt spray, and the challenges of a coastal landscape. This is a very effective planting of sweet fern. This retaining wall is a sitting wall, so you kind of sit up against this plant and it just smells like spicy, sweet kind of cinnamon. Really, really good use of this plant. This is an old garden in the woods picture. What I really liked about this picture is all those yellow flowers in there are the native wood poppy, and we didn't plant any of them. They just kind of naturalized into this area, and it looked lovely. The white flowers you can see on the ground there are from Halesea, the tree above. It's the mountain silverbell, another plant that's kind of native-ish, depending on how you want to define things. And then here is a garden at Norcross. This is, running foam flower, yellow lady slippers, Goldie's wood fern. This is a cultivated space. And notice how none of these previous pictures had mulch in them, or at least not in the traditional sense. I'll argue right here the mulch is Tiarella, the foam flower. And so it gets me thinking, what is mulch actually doing for us? it actually does quite a bit of good stuff for us. This is not a don't use mulch argument. This is a change the way you look at mulch argument, because it does all these great things, but the thing is plants do them much better. There's not a single thing that mulch does that an established crop of plants can do better. And so what that tells me is that mulch is a really useful tool for young spaces, early gardens. Let's go back a picture. That is Garden in the Woods. That was heading down the woodland trail, towards the lily pond, and we had just planted that area out. You can see plugs, you can see space in between, you can see the leaf mold we were using for mulch, and that is the same site. Later in the season, that was probably the next spring. And what you've got here is our mulch is phlox, tiarella, a little bit of stylophorm. Plants work very well as mulch. You just need the right plants. And when we start thinking about this, we start thinking that, well, if we're going to start using plants as mulch, then that mulch, that traditional mulch we put down, should break down, should feed the soil, should help those plants to fill in quickly. So then all of a sudden, the idea of, say, a bark mulch is making a lot less sense because bark doesn't break down quickly. So when I'm mulching at home or at Norcross, we're using wood chips, we're using compost, we're using leaf mold. More often than not, I'm using a combination of compost and wood chips because they're readily available, they're inexpensive, and they work very well. They feed the soil, they break down, and the plants fill in, which is what I want. And if we're going to do this, we need the right plants. Not every plant makes a good living mulch. We need just the right species that has this kind of good balance between spread and companionship. We've got something like some of the spreading goldenrods. We got great spread, but not great companionship. This will be, you plant these as mulch in your area and you'll have lots of goldenrod and very few other plants. That's not what we're looking for. On the other end of the spectrum, we got something like bluets. Lovely, lovely species. Great companion plant. No spread. At least not in the way we need for mulch. Next question is the plant, our living mulch, is that plant going to spread via seed or by root? And there's no right or wrong here. We kind of want both, although for the most part, we tend to lean in that root, that rhizomatous or stoloniferous, that kind of spready colonizing sort of format. But it's nice to throw a few seed spreaders into the mix as well. That wood poppy that you saw in the previous picture with the yellow flowers, that is a seed spreader. This picture here is the wild geranium. Cool little candelabras that it does. It flings seed off. So my go-to for living mulch in many gardens, especially in woodland gardens, is running foam flower. Tiarella stolonifera, a lot of people may know this plant as Tiarella cordifolia variety cordifolia, which is the running form of the plant. It was recently renamed stolonifera, which I think makes a lot of sense because this is a stoloniferous plant. The southern form of this doesn't run by stolon. So if you've got a Tiarella that sits in your garden and just grows a little bit bigger every year and doesn't ever run, you've got the southern form. It's not stoloniferous. It's a nice plant. It just doesn't make great living mulch. This is a plant that looks good in flower. It looks good in foliage. This cool foliage here is not a cultivated form. It was just a fun chance seedling that we happened to find at Garden in the Woods. And this plant is that perfect level of spread and companionship where you can plant it with delicate things like yellow lady slippers or a rare wood fern, and it does just fine, but it also spreads quickly enough to kind of function as mulch in garden spaces. This is what happens when you grow it from seed, which is kind of cool because in general, in most nursery and kind of horticultural industries, this is a plant grown by cuttings or divisions because frankly, that's faster. And so that results in a cheaper plant when it comes down to selling it to a client. But you lose the diversity when you do it that way. I was kind of flabbergasted when Garden in the Woods started really making an effort to grow plants from seed more so than they had ever done in the past. And we started growing this one from seed, and we saw this amazing variation of leaf forms showing up in the crops that we were growing out. It's just fun to have this kind of calico effect in the garden. Canada Mayflower, I'm like the PR manager for Canada Mayflower. This plant is the underdog. It is often just thought of as a weed because it spreads very, very quickly. And that is, for some people, kind of scary. It's like, oh my God, this thing's taking over. The amazing thing about this plant, though, is it roots into the soil so darn shallowly that just about everything else can just grow in amongst it. And when you put it into a more cultivated setting and give it a little more sun and maybe a little bit of a better soil, you can get a really nice kind of flower and then fruiting display off this thing. But this is a plant that will happily grow in amongst other species. These are three quite or maybe not uncommon, but delicate growers. On the left, we have gold thread. In the middle, we have partridge berry. And on the right side, we have Gaultheria, the wintergreen. These are not fast-growing plants, and yet they're all happy to grow in amongst the Canada Mayflower. It's a very, very shallow-rooted plant. So even though it's going to spread very quickly around your other plants, even if they're just, establishing, as long as we're talking about any clumping perennial, they're just going to root right down underneath that Canada Mayflower and push right through it without any problems at all, which makes this a really nice living mulch because it fills in quickly but doesn't take over. Macro bovata, the running ground cell. I like this plant. It's got these lovely kind of purple tinges to the foliage in the early season. You can see the flowers that have that kind of purple center and a little bit of yellow popping out. And by the time it fully blooms, the purple is gone. It's just bright yellow. I don't know why. It always makes me think of that picture of a sun with just the two eyes and a big smile on its face. It's just a happy looking flower. This is another one that spreads, pretty quickly on the ground. Fills in quite nicely and works well with other species that can kind of grow in amongst it, those kind of standard clumping perennials. This is a plant that does perfectly fine in the full sun. In fact, it's also very happy in moist soil, so I'm often planting this one with things like scarlet bee balm or Joe Pye weed or really any clumping fern, or, you get the idea. Here it is in a garden setting. I believe this was in Wayland, Mass. It's growing next to Lacothaway and a little violet in the middle that might have been planted or might have just been left, and a few non-native plants. I think that might be Liriope in the back, but my knowledge of non-natives is definitely dropping. I've been working exclusively with natives for a while now. The hosta, at least, I can still recognize. All right. So we're talking about mulch. We're talking about weeds. This is not a philosophical question. Think about this. Where do weeds come from? They don't spontaneously appear. We disproved that back in, I think, the 1800s. For the most part, they're coming in from above, often wind dispersed. Thinking about something like chickweed, dock, mullein, dandelion, we're looking at seed coming down from above. Occasionally, it's coming out of the back end of a bird. Some of our invasive species do that, something like bittersweet or buckthorn. But what that means is that this stuff, woven landscape fabric, is useless because the weeds, maybe 3% of them are coming up from the ground. Most of them are coming down as seed from above, usually as an annual or a biennial species. So you put down the weed fabric, you cover that over with some mulch or some soil, and then the weeds come down, land in your mulch or your soil, and they grow up above this. And all you've got is a whole bunch of plastic in your landscape. This is considered one of the most prominent sources of microplastics in soils in the landscape. This landscape fabric that we've been told was a good idea. It's not. Don't use it. So when we start thinking about this, to think we could ever stop seeds from doing what seeds do is not realistic. But what we can do is make it so that the seeds that are constantly moving around on our landscapes that are in our seed bank are good seeds. This one, columbine, is a great example of this. This is a plant that you plant this in your garden and it's a steady state garden. It's going to peter out in a few years. This is a species that is constantly reseeding in the landscape. It does very well in disturbed soils. And we've got a lot of really cool plants that do that, and we can use that. That's something where we can start putting these on the landscape. 3 native-ish annuals that work very well in the landscape. What's really nice about these plants is as an annual and as a, kind of a native annual, this is readily available and very cheap. You rarely find these as established plants in the nursery, but you can get your hands on this seed through just about any seed supplier, often very inexpensively. If you are the sort of person who really wants native to my region, that partridge pea on the right side is native to, throughout New England. Coreopsis tinctoria, the plains coreopsis and the blanket flower are native-ish to our area, kind of depending on how you want to define native. If you call it the Northeast, they fall in. If you want to go New England, they fall out. But these are plants that oftentimes when I'm working in young garden spaces, what I'll do is I'll plant my plugs of whatever plants I want to, and then I will overseed the plugs. And these are plants that I often overseed with, and they're ones that you can just kind of throw down on the landscape with good chances of success. Short-lived perennials work very well in a similar manner. Spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata, wild columbine, Aquilegia canadensis, black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta. These are 3 species that, in a landscape without any disturbance will often disappear after a few years. But with any level of disturbance, these things will come right back on you. It's kind of fun. This picture here is one that I always liked because you see a lot of black-eyed Susan in that picture. This is in the coastal sandplain garden at Garden in the Woods. We did not plant a single black-eyed Susan in that garden. we planted a garden, and the black-eyed Susan, which was 300 yards to the left in a meadow area, had been seeding around for years. So when we went in and disturbed the soil and pulled out some plants and put in others, all these black-eyed Susans showed up, and some columbines and a few other goodies. Not the Monarda punctata. We had to introduce that one. But the idea here was that instead of calling these weeds, now it's just an editable plant. It's a, do I want the black-eyed Susan there? Chances might be yes. It's a great plant. And if you don't, it's easy to pull out. But now instead of your seed, your spontaneous seed in the landscape always being a weed like a chickweed or a mullein, it's sometimes chickweed, it's sometimes mullein, it's sometimes black-eyed Susan, it's sometimes plains coreopsis, it's sometimes spotted bee balm. At least half the time we're leaving the plant and saying, ooh, free plants. Okay. As I said, I've got a 4-hour version of Kill Your Lawn. This is not today. So let me make it simple. Lawns are stupid. Lawns need to go away already. We need a better version of a lawn if we're going to keep some version of a lawn. Because lawns are, frankly, stupid. There's something that we work very hard for, and they really give us nothing in return. So I like to tell people to kill their lawn. There is one thing, though, that I really like about lawns, and that is that they are potential. Lawns are soil. Lawns are a place to plant plants. It's much easier to make a lawn into good habitat than it is, say, a parking lot. And that is something to be happy about. So what do we do about this? Killing your lawn is a good option. It's something I will often recommend to people. That being said, it's not the only option. And there's something to be said for taking this in kind of small steps and saying, maybe I'm going to reduce my lawn a little bit, and over time, I might eventually kill it all off, but let's start small. Starting small is often the best way to go. I've got this idea of the gradients of ecology. And this is kind of looking at our various different options for I'm rethinking my lawn. Starting on the top of the list is that perfect, I'm imagining the perfect monoculture, Kentucky bluegrass, golf course style lawn. That thing is actively killing life. You could grow that sort of lawn and treat it in a bit more of a sustainable fashion, and that's going to be a step in the right direction. Oftentimes for people, these kind of low-mow options and non-native lawn replacements are a really, really good middle ground. They're accessible, they're inexpensive, they're doable, and they are a huge step in the right direction. We get into the native alternatives and you start really building life. And then the final one is, okay, it's not even going to be a lawn anymore. Now it's going to be a meadow, or now it's going to be a forest, or now it's going to be something completely different. And those can really start to build habitat, obviously, depending on what you turn it into. So let's look at a few of these non-native options, because as I said, these are really a good option for a lot of people. They usually go under the name eco-lawn or eco-grass or no-mow lawn or no-mow grass or some version of that. They're predominantly made up of cool season fescues. Some of them are cool season fescues mixed with clover, which I really like. If anyone's ever confused about what we mean by cool season grasses and warm season grasses, what we're calling out, cool or warm, is the time of year the plant's growing. So a cool season grass grows in spring and fall. A warm season grass grows in summer. Most of our native grasses are warm season grasses. Things like, little blue stem or big blue stem or yellow plume grass. The nice thing about cool season fescues, though, is they put on all of their growth during the time of year when things grow more slowly. Think about a traditional lawn and when you're mowing. You mow once or twice in spring and fall, but it's summertime. Hot summer, especially with some rain, you're out there mowing weekly. You take that growth away and put it in spring and fall, and these grasses often need to be mowed once or twice a year, no more. So the amount of carbon we're putting into the landscape, the amount of mowing we're doing drastically drops immediately. What we're not necessarily doing is building great habitat, but we're drastically reducing the amount of damage we do with a standard lawn treatment. They need no water or fertilizer once established. And two specific ones I've worked with quite successfully is Eco-Lawn through Prairie Moon and Eco-Grass through Wildflower Farm. But as I said, these are pretty popular these days. They're pretty common. You could find them in most places. Look for a mix that says a lot of cool season fescues, and I love mixing some white clover into that mix. Or you can also do clover on its own. Clover lawns are another thing that's kind of becoming a thing. They're great. They're not going to be nearly as ecologically viable as a native alternative, but for a non-native plant, clover's pretty good. It feeds a lot of generalist bees. It doesn't really do a lot of specialized sort of stuff as far as we know, but it's a fine plant for replacing a lawn with. Definitely a step in the right direction. And in terms of advantages and disadvantages, it's time and cost. These are cheap, they're affordable. You can buy seed online, have it shipped to your door. There's going to come with very specific instructions on how to prep your soil. You sow your seed, you're going to have an eco lawn. You can do this in 1 to 2 seasons, which is something we can kind of do for some of the natives, but not for most of them. And as I said, it can be really inexpensive, comparatively. It's still going to cost you a decent amount of money kind of up front, but the amount of maintenance just drastically drops off. And these are thought to kind of pay themselves off usually within 3 years. Disadvantages are ecological value. As I said, these are a huge step in the right direction, but these are not really building good habitat the way native plants can. So looking at some natives, if you want a lawn that still looks like a lawn, Carex pennsylvanica is a great choice for you. This is the Pennsylvania sedge. It's a rhizomatous. It's not technically a grass, but it looks like one, so who cares? This thing naturally grows under oaks and pines, so it can do shade, it can do thin soils, doesn't need watering, doesn't need fertilizing, doesn't need mowing. Middle picture is it in a garden setting. This is actually quite a nice plant just as a garden plant. I use it often on trail edges where it works very nicely in conjunction with whitewood aster. Blooms in the spring. Not nearly as showy as the aster, but cool for, a graminoid. I'm happy to see them. This is it growing in dense shade at Norcross. You can see it's not quite as thick in that picture as the picture on the left where it's growing in the sun, but it works quite nicely. Here's the downside to it. It's going to take 3 to 4 years for this thing to fill in. This is not a fast-growing plant. The advantage to that is once it's established, the amount of mowing you need to do is once a year and you're done. But in terms of kind of filling in and giving you a lawn, those eco lawns, 1 to 2 years, we're looking at 3 to 4 years in this case. It's also reasonably expensive. You can't just sow seed for the carices. We haven't come up, like us propagators haven't come up with a good way to just bag and sow seed the way you can those native annuals I was talking about earlier. So you got to plant plugs, which is expensive. My favorite lawn replacement when we're trying to plant a new version of a lawn is the wild strawberry lawn. Fragaria virginiana, this is the only plant I've actually botanically accurately tattooed on my body. This is a phenomenally valuable plant ecologically, and then it's also got all of these advantages for us humans. First off, as a lawn, you can abuse the living daylights out of this plant. The Carex we just talked about can handle some light foot traffic. This thing can handle heavy foot traffic. This can handle wild chickens, free-range chickens, foraging in it, which I have tested at home numerous times. This can handle dogs that like to dig holes in it. The nice thing about this plant, and this actually also goes true for the Carex pennsylvanica, is that both of these are spreading plants. So you can kind of, if you want to start small, start a small section, plant some wild strawberries or maybe the Carex, and you're ready to move to the next area. You can start digging out chunks of your previous ones, moving it to a new area. The holes you dug in the previous will fill right back in. The new area starts to fill in. We've got a flower in spring that ecologically is kind of cool to see, but doesn't actually do a lot. Feed some generalist bees. The major value on this one is the leaves. The leaves support 87 different Lepidoptera in my region, a huge amount of caterpillars that will feed on this plant. And notice in the pictures here, you can't see that. You don't see huge amounts of damage. Our native animals and our native plants have evolved together. There's a balance there. This is also a vigorous enough grower where if a caterpillar ever manages to eat an entire leaf, it just grows a new one very quickly. This one will fill in a lot faster than the Carex does, that sedge we just talked about. Some pictures so we planted this lawn at Norcross in early spring. What we're looking at in the background, the blurry images, is the late spring. You can see some kind of lighter green. That's the new growth. The darker green is pretty much the plugs we planted. We actually got a fruit, fruiting that season, which was exciting. We didn't expect it in the very first year of establishment. By year 2 in early spring, we're in full bloom. You'll get your largest and most robust fruit in that second year because the plants haven't yet started to compete with each other. You notice how there's some holes in this lawn, some brown we can still see. It's not fully filled in yet, but by the end of that season, it is. And puts on a fall display, which is really nice because even a traditional lawn doesn't do that. And as I said, this thing can handle abuse. You can walk all over this plant. It's perfectly fine with it. Another species we're starting to play with, Prunella vulgaris subspecies lanceolata, the American self-heal. This plant appears to be one of the most important plants in our landscape for rare and uncommon bees. There's a theory that this plant helps to regulate the gut biome of bees. It's a theory. It's not yet proven, so we're not really sure. But there seems to be an instance. There seems to be a preference for bees to visit this flower, even when there's lots of other things around. It's very important. We're just not exactly sure why. It also ranges into a true blue color, which is hard to find in the plant world. I don't know how many people have ever noticed us botanists or us horticulturists like to lie about color all the time. We call things blue that are actually purple. We call things red that are pink. This one can actually go real blue, though more often than not, it's in the purple spectrum, sometimes pink. This picture on the left is it planted at Norcross, 2 years from closely spaced plugs. I think in general you can have a lawn in 2 years on this one, but if you're spreading it further out, which is perfectly viable and will be cheaper in the long term, it'll probably take more like 3. This one can handle a decent amount of abuse as well. Maybe not as much as the wild strawberry, but it's getting close to it. This is a short section of the class because I'm not going to cover all these plants today. So this is the slide that, as I said, is available. I'm happy to send this out. I got a PDF of it. What we're looking at here is native plants that I have found that tend to just work very well in just about any landscape I've worked in. Obviously, if you plant a plant that likes it rarely dry in the wet, it's not going to work. But as long as you're using some basic common sense, these are winners. They are plants that tend to function very well in just about any place I've planted them. And as I said, I will happily share this slide with anyone who hasn't already written it all down or screenshotted it. A few plants worth calling out on that picture: the wild geranium that we talked about earlier when we were comparing it to the garden geranium. These beautiful purple flowers that I really dig. Often coming, not often, but often enough, you can find this blooming white in the landscape, and then you can find white, kind of forms of this in the horticultural industry if you want some kind of variation in color. Notice in this picture here, the geranium is those kind of leaves on the bottom underneath the dicentra, that bleeding heart there. What I like to point out is those leaves in themselves are texturally interesting. So even when this plant is not blooming and it's got a nice long bloom season, it's still an interesting plant. I think the fruits are even more interesting. Maybe not as showy as the flowers, but this cool candelabra. You notice how a few seeds are still towards the bottom of that structure and some of them are curled up to the top. It literally catapults seeds off. It's its way of dispersing seeds. So once you plant a few of these, you'll find new plants showing up within about maybe 6 feet of the original planting as these kind of plants are flung around. Spirea tomentosa, I cannot understand why the native spireas are not more common in the horticultural industry. They are nicer than the Chinese and the Japanese ones that are very common, and yet they're just not represented. I think meadowsweet might be my personal favorite when we're talking about the native spireas, but the Spirea alba, I've got my names wrong here. Spirea tomentosa, this one is steeplebush. The white one is meadowsweet. Either way, they're lovely plants. I really like this pink one. What I like about it is as the pink fades, it kind of fades into that like bronzy color. And then you get these standing dried pretty much fruits later in the season that are just texturally interesting. This is a plant that'll grow in very wet sites and very dry sites. The picture on the left is a wetland edge. The picture on the right is under a dry power line cut. And what's nice about the native spireas is you can treat these as a standard perennial. This can go into an area that gets mowed or cut back regularly. These are sometimes described as a cutback shrub. You can just let them grow. You don't need to cut them back. There's no real reason to. But if you want to put this in an area that's going to get mowed, say a meadow, or put this in an area where you want to just kind of hack it back every few years, this is a perfectly acceptable practice for our native spireas. I'm a big fan of the goldenrods. There's a lot of phenomenal ones out there. They get a bad rap for causing hay fever. They do not. They also get a bad rap for being weeds, which is not fair when we've got about 53 species, only about 5 of which are really weedy and the rest are not. This is one of my favorite ones, especially for woodland spaces. Solidagocacia, which goes under about 6 different common names. Wreath goldenrod, axillary goldenrod, blue stem goldenrod, 3 names. There's probably a few more I'm not thinking of. This is a great way to kind of lighten up a dark space. You can see how the flowers bloom in the axis of the leaves, hence that axillary goldenrod. You can also see how if you imagine cutting that long stem and just tying it into a wreath, you've kind of got a ready-made wreath goldenrod. And the stem's kind of blue, so blue stem goldenrod. The goldenrods, as I've already mentioned a couple times, are phenomenally valuable, both for Lepidoptera and bees. This is the #1 genus in terms of ecological viability in the landscape when we're looking at just the herbaceous plants. Nothing beats the goldenrods. Wild strawberries are generally close. The goldenrods beat them by even quite a bit. This is the picture of it. It's not quite to this stage yet, but I've got a certain love for the kind of full, we tend to say brown as if it's a bad color, and yet, the plants often prove us wrong. Those rich kind of lovely sort of oranges and browns and mahoganies and cherries, and, just stop calling it brown and start calling it mahogany, and all of a sudden it just sounds sexier. And I really love the look of these kind of fluffy seed pods in fall, and I love seeing them seed around and show up in new places of the landscape. This is a goldenrod that will seed around. It doesn't seed around strongly. This is not one I've ever heard anyone call weedy, but you'll find new plants on the landscape. This is just free plants. Definitely leading into the fall stuff because of the time of year. Blue wood aster, Symphyotrichum or Aster cordifolium. This is a lovely species that is rarely actually blue, but still gets the name. It's on the purple spectrum occasionally. There's some blue tinges in that picture, but more often than not, we're in the kind of white to purple to pink to bluish sort of spectrum. But it is just a lovely, lovely plant. This is one that gets quite a bit taller than the whitewood aster, but doesn't spread nearly as strongly as the whitewood aster. Wood aster is actually a group. It doesn't describe that they grow in the woods. There's a purple wood aster that grows in the full sun. It's just kind of a misnomer. But this is a woodland species, and it's one that gets generally tall. Although it's also one that, interestingly enough, I find the deer will browse this one pretty much through July, and then they stop browsing it. And when they do that, it just puts on new flower buds, and you'll find it still blooms perfectly fine, and instead is blooming in the like 12 to 18 inch range instead of the 24 to 30 inch range that it can bloom if it's not browsed. That being said, if you want it shorter, you can just cut it back in June. Okay, running towards the end, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. There's this idea of these kind of species combinations that just work in certain places on the landscape. Full sun thin soils, this picture again, Edgartown Public Library and Martha's Vineyard. Dry acidic shade, kind of a classic New England problem child. I'm not going to cover wet meadow conditions today because I had to narrow things down for this lecture, but this is another one of those areas we're just kind of thinking about what species work generally in these conditions. And the last piece of this is cultural expectations. I have this picture saved in my folder as worst tree ever. That's a Bradford, a calorie pear. It's a nice new invasive species. It's the worst mulch volcano I've ever seen, and that is a just horrible pruning job. This is what a lot of people see. You go around on the landscape, and if you're not a plant nerd, what you see is people with landscapes with meatballs and rocket chips and red mulch, and you think, well, that's what I ought to do. And that's something that as a landscaper or as a gardener or as anyone, we kind of need to talk a little bit more about, because this is not good cultural practices, and yet this is normal. So for thin soils, full sun, this is my go-to mix. And this is not the end of the diversity. This is often the backbone that I can then add individuals of other species to. Little blue stem is easily one of my favorite native grasses. I mentioned how I love goldenrod. Solidago nemorosa, the gray goldenrod, is a really lovely species. Stays quite a bit shorter than any of the others, usually in the 8 to 10 to maybe 12 inch range. Stiff aster blooms really at the exact same size as stiff goldenrod. That showy aster there in the kind of middle is the one that's also sometimes called purple wood aster. I don't like that common name because it doesn't grow in the woods, and it's confusing. Those are the largest flowers of any aster in our region. They get huge. I mean, we're talking like 2 inches wide. Spotted bee balm and black-eyed Susan I've already mentioned. Great plants for thin soils, dry sites, and especially good plants for anywhere with some regular disturbance. Because they'll just kind of keep reseeding in those disturbed soils. Dry acid shade, blue wood aster, as I already mentioned, and wreath goldenrod again. Black cohosh is kind of funny. That plant is actually quite rare in the wild. It's very common in the garden industry. It's even a little bit overly spready in certain garden settings. Same thing can be said for the whitewood aster. Oftentimes when we're talking about kind of tougher spots in the landscape, we want plants that do spread more strongly, and they work very well in those tougher areas. That doesn't always mean they're the right plant for every area. If you've got a delicate little woodland garden with some trillium and some, kind of hepaticas, then whitewood aster and black cohosh might not be the best choice. But if you've got that dry acidic shade site, maybe the edge of the woods or an area where things are just not growing all that well, that's where you want to kind of break out the big guns. Finally, last thing I want to kind of cover is the idea of fall cleanup, or the idea of really not doing too much fall cleanup. And the idea here is that there's kind of a lot of reasons to do a little bit less. It's often better for the plants, especially if we get that sort of cold and drier winter where there's not a lot of snow cover. What's very good about leaving these plants standing is the snow, as you can see in this picture, will sit on the stems of the plants. And as the sun starts to warm it up, they melt and they slide down the plant, and that kind of packs the snow right around the crown of the plant, which is exactly where we want it. Snow is actually a very good insulator. And if we're talking about a plant that maybe wasn't doing all that well, or was just planted in fall, or is kind of marginally hardy, having as much snow over the crown of that plant can mean the difference between success and failure of that plant. Plants produce seed. Seed is eaten by birds. I will never understand why we cut back all our plants in fall and then go to the store to buy bird seed. This is free bird seed. That's Monarda fistulosa there, the wild bergamot. And if that seed manages to get through the bird system and come out the back end, it's free plants. About a third of our bees nest in the ground over winter. The rest nest in standing, dried herbaceous stems, mostly herbaceous, a couple woody species. So if we're cutting back all our plants in the fall, we're removing that habitat from the garden. If we wait till really late fall in the winter, we're likely removing that habitat with bees in the habitat. And then when we take it to the compost pile, they rarely survive that. Butterflies are less consistent than the bees. They overwinter in a variety of different ways. Many of them overwinter as caterpillars, like the woolly bear we can see here. They overwinter in the leaf litter. So when we're removing that leaf litter from the landscape, we're removing that habitat, we're removing those caterpillars. There's some really cool ones that'll be found in that leaf litter as either a caterpillar or as a chrysalis or as an egg. Occasionally, there's some butterflies that'll overwinter in that adult butterfly phase, but that's pretty uncommon in our region. And as I said, free plants. A lot of plants have evolved to not release all their seed until later in the season. Something like Rudbeckia hirta or Monarda, sorry, not Monarda, this plant here, Anemone virginiana. This plant produces these kind of fluffy seeds that are very good at kind of hitting the snow and then traveling across the top of the snow, especially if you get that crusty snow cover. Really good way to disperse over long distances. And that just looks cool. It also means free seedlings the following season. And the idea here is not to just say, okay, immediately don't do anything. It's to find what works for you. On the spectrum of do a whole lot of cleanup and do no cleanup at all, I want to kind of give you reasons to be on the side of the do no cleanup, but you do what works for you in your landscape. With that in mind, I have a whopping 4 minutes left, but unless we have to crash out of here right at 7 o'clock, I am very happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you all for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Aviva, are you still around? Can we do some questions? Catherine, you hear me?
I am right here. Yes, we absolutely can do some questions. I see Andrea Good has already put something there. For those who are not staying for questions, please make sure you check out that SurveyMonkey link in the chat before you go. It shouldn't take you any more than 2 to 3 minutes. But yes, Andrea, excuse me if I'm saying it wrong, but go ahead and let us know what you got.
Sure. One of the questions that always seems to come up is straight species or cultivars.
How many hours do we have? All right, so I'll try and give you my quick version of it. Ecologically, the straight species is always going to be the most valuable possible choice. There are some instances where certain cultivars appear to have a similar amount of ecological value to the straight species, but that's kind of the exception to prove the rule. For the most part, the cultivars tend to be less valuable, sometimes a lot less valuable, sometimes just a little bit less valuable. And a lot of the information we've got at this point, which is very new, because this is a question we've really only started asking recently, is based on, say, adult visitation and doesn't necessarily take into account, say, caterpillar visitation on a leaf. So we've got a partial story here. That being said, I will take a native plant cultivar any day over a non-native species. And I think finding a happy middle ground is often a really good way to go about it. People love Annabelle hydrangea because it produces a big showy flower. If you've got the space too and you really like it, plant Annabelle hydrangea, maybe plant some natural species hydrangea arborescens on the same landscape and you kind of got the best of both worlds when that's an option. And if you're really just trying to do the kind of top thing for ecology, you're going to really want to work for, whenever possible, seed-grown, native species, generally local provenance.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. It's always a good question.
Before I go to the next one in our queue, I will say, Dan, if you have time to stay a little late for questions, that's fantastic. Anybody else who would like to stay late for questions, that's fantastic. With how many engaged question askers we have, I would hate to cut this off, especially with such a fantastic presentation. So I just wanted to say that. And we'll leave the recording on for the Q&A as well, so members will be able to access this later. With that, Michelle, go ahead and come off of mute and let us know your question.
Dan, spectacular presentation. I really appreciate the way you organized it, and your data is fabulous. Specific question, you mentioned a study being done. Is it being done at Norcross Wildlife that is looking at host plants and bees? I'd like to add that to the considerations that I give to clients when evaluating plant choices. We've got the Lepidoptera data. Do you mention that they've got bee data?
Yeah, we don't have any sort of published bee data at this point. What we've got right now is 3 years of observations that will eventually become a published paper running through the Gagir lab. This is something that is if you go to Gagir lab on Google, you'll actually find a lot of recommendations for plantings, and that is partially because of the Norcross stuff, but he's also doing some separate things. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at, what species of plants are attracting both the most species of bees, but also the highest kind of, individual visitation. Monarda fistulosa keeps winning the numbers. That's wild bergamot. A couple other standouts that keep popping up really high on that bee list is some interesting kind of gray zone examples. Blue star, Amsonia, which is not technically native to New England. That one seems to really be, hugely valuable for bees right here in New England, keeping it interesting. Another one was the anise hyssop. We're not sure if it's specifically Agastache funiculum or some of the other ones. We also have Agastache scrofularifolia and Agastache nepetoides at Norcross, and they can be hard to tell apart. And the people doing this study are bee specialists, not really plant specialists. So it's kind of a little hunky, but Agastaches are very, very valuable.
Terrific. You mentioned Gear Lab. Is that Gearlab?
Gegear. Gagir. Yep.
Gegear lab LAB.
Yes. You just
Terrific.
type in,
Thank you very much.
If you type in Gagir, you'll find a website. It'll be talking about bees. You'll know you're in the right place.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Myra, go ahead. Myra Schwartz, I see you've got your hand raised.
Great
Yes.
presentation. The only question I have is, what about water? What about extreme weather conditions? Do you have recommendations? I know it's probably another presentation on how to build resilience into gardens and landscape regarding water and drought and things like that.
Yeah, it's especially interesting now because this year has been one of the wettest years I've ever worked in, and last year was one of the driest years I've ever worked in. And I think that to one extent or another, that's kind of becoming our new norm, these wild fluctuations. And what I can say is that working in some of our meadows, some of our woodlands, some of these landscapes, something I've definitely seen is the difference, especially in the meadows. We can have a meadow. It's the exact same meadow that it was last year, but the species that I'm seeing in it from one year to the next in terms of what's blooming most, what's showing off most, can sometimes be wildly different. And what's it's telling me is that there's winners and losers depending on the season. And so really trying to increase your diversity as much as possible so you've got the option for winners and losers every year is a really good thing to do. Another kind of piece of that is increasing the diversity of the ways plants can respond. So having some plants that are very quick to respond to disturbance, seed-grown plants like those short-lived perennials and some of those annual species are really valuable in the landscape. It's something where, diversity is always a good thing. It's good from an ecological point of view. It also seems to build resiliency into the landscape. The other thing that we've been looking at, and this is a big question, and I'm not telling you to do this, but I'm telling you we should think about this, is what are we planting in terms of future landscaping? What does Massachusetts look like in 50 years? Is it going to be like Virginia? Should we be planting plants that are more heat tolerant? Most of our native flora can handle quite a bit of heat, but there's some exceptions to that rule. Something like larch or sugar maple are probably going to start to lose out in the future. So identifying the right places to plant those, because we don't want to lose sugar maple. So you got a nice cool little depression. That's a great place to plant those sort of species. You got an area where you don't think it's going to be cold. You think, hey, this is open. It's going to get, sunny. You might want to start thinking maybe sugar maple isn't the best choice, but I really want a maple. Maybe it's a silver maple or a red maple, or kind of start thinking about specifically on the landscape, what areas are going to be more consistent from year to year and what areas aren't, and kind of choose your plantings based on that. But the first thing is diversity. Try and get as many different species into those areas as possible, and throw down a lot of seed.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing other hands raised at the moment, but I do have a question in the chat from Susan Socks.
Yeah, what do you got?
Susan says, I do edible landscaping in addition to native landscaping.
Me too.
Are there some plants that are both good for human uses and good for wildlife?
Oh, there's
Forgive
a
me
lot
if I
of them.
mispronounce this one. Aronia melanocarpa comes to mind, but interested in other options.
I actually have a presentation called For Us and Them, which is about edible plants for us and wildlife, because there's actually a lot that overlap really nicely. What first got me into native plants was food. I didn't really want to, at the time, I didn't see what the point in putting all this effort into growing something that I could get at the supermarket was. So I was like, why would you grow tomatoes? I've learned now there's a very big difference between the tomato in my garden and the one at the supermarket. But what I started with was things like service berries, raspberries, blueberries, some of the more common edible native species. I talked about kind of numbers. Oaks are the most valuable tree in New England. Goldenrods are the most valuable forb, kind of flowering herbaceous plant in New England. The most valuable ecological shrub in New England is a highbush blueberry, which also happens to be really, really tasty. And aronia that you mentioned is hugely valuable. Hazelnuts are hugely valuable, the American hazelnuts. There's some less common edible species that are really valuable too, and start bringing some unique flavors into your kind of kitchen, which is always fun. Something like spicebush, the sweet birches, black birch and yellow birch make a phenomenal tea, and that tea can, if you want to get kind of even more creative with it, can make a really nice cocktail. Anise hyssop, as we mentioned earlier, is a really, really good bee plant. That's a phenomenal one for a mint sauce or a yogurt sauce, or for a cup of tea, or for, I make a cocktail called what do we call it? A cucumber, an anise hyssop hiccup. Which is pretty much a cucumber anise, tequila drink. As I said, I got a whole lecture on this. So if you'd like, I've already forgotten who asked this question. I've got a list that I can send you. Shoot me an email or shoot Aviva an email and ask for that list, and then I'll get it out and can send you a whole list of plants that are edible and really ecologically viable. And one resource I'll send you to that you can kind of find some of that information yourself. Back when I was at Garden in the Woods, we were building up a plant finder database. It's called the Plant Finder database, or maybe the Garden Finder database. Go onto the Native Plant Trust website and you'll find a link to it. And that system allows you to kind of select what you're looking for, and it'll spit out a list of plants for you. And you can select. We've got a thing called Pollinator Powerhouse, or you can just assume that the plants on there are native and are ecologically viable. And you can select edible as well, and you'll get a list that kind of pumps out a whole bunch of plants for you. From there, you could also select, say, sunny and dry, or the environment you're planting in. So you can really kind of do this yourself. That being said, I'm also very happy to share the list. Just send off an email.
Awesome. James, I see you, but I've got one more question in chat that I want to get to before I have you come off mute. Warren Ackerman asks, any good plant recommendations for side of road, lots of salt, full sun, dry area? Currently just lawn, but would like to mix in ground cover / flowers. TIA.
Yeah. This is where you want to look at the sort of plants that we tend to think of as weeds in the garden, but we're talking native still. So roughleaf goldenrod is the goldenrod that gives goldenrods a bad rap for being too weedy. It's a phenomenal plant for roadside, green roof, parking lot islands, those sort of challenging conditions, because it can handle ridiculous abuse, as in like an 18-wheeler running it over sort of abuse. It'll either survive that or it'll come back from seed very readily. And it's those sort of species. So common milkweed is a good one. Little blue stem is a good one for these sort of areas. If you've got some space for something that gives you a little bit of height or a little bit of woody, I'm thinking like a parking lot island, something like the shrubby St. John's wort, Hypericum prolificum. I've seen bayberries in those sort of conditions. They're slow growing, but can handle quite a bit of abuse. This is, a lot of times you want to work with the plants that are kind of more over the top. If you've got the space for it, staghorn sumac is a phenomenal plant. It's a spreader, so it's not the sort of plant you want to put in a small area. But if we're talking of a hell strip, which is, the term I've usually heard for that area between, say, the sidewalk and the road, that's a really great plant for it. I'll point you towards Wild Seed Project. They're a really good group. They've got a website that's really phenomenal, and they've got a whole article on hell strip plantings and plants they've tested in those sort of conditions. And they could probably throw a whole bunch of ideas at you that might come into my head if I keep thinking about it, but they're not popping up right now. My go-to is wild strawberry is on that list, common milkweed, some of the more vigorous goldenrods, roughleaf goldenrod, Canada goldenrod, the sort of ones you don't tend to plant in gardens, little blue stem. I think that's my basic running kind of list of go-tos. James, what do you got?
Okay.
Oh, you took it from me.
We're down in New York. I'm inundated with mugwort, and love the idea of these lawns. And all I keep thinking of is all the goddamn weeds I'm going to have to pull out of them, and how long will I have to do that for?
Yeah. There's this is in that bigger kind of lawn, kill your lawn lecture. I've got like, how do we get from lawn to this? And mugwort is actually an even harder job than from lawn. You got a couple different options. None of them are great. They've all got advantages and disadvantages, but they give you options. Standard routine is herbicide, which has plenty of downsides to it, but is going to be faster and cheaper than the next options I'll give you that allow you to avoid herbicides. Mugwort is kind of pernicious. Because even if you do herbicide it, what you do is kill the plants. You don't kill off the seed bank. The seed bank comes back, the mugwort comes back. So you need to kind of do it repeatedly, which means a decent amount of herbicide on the landscape, which is something plenty of people would like to avoid. Two other options would be smothering, which is something that can work for mugwort, keeping in mind that mugwort is going to come back from a seed bank. So if we're talking a small area, smallish, what you can do is lay down cardboard. And what I'll often do is use something like ramboard or floor protectant. So we're talking rolls of cardboard. You lay it out. You top that off with some wood chips or some topsoil or some compost or a combination of all three. You plant your plugs into that. What you've effectively done is buried the mugwort seed bank. And what you do is, you cut back all your mugwort. You don't bother to weed it out. You cover it all over with that compost and a couple inches of material, and that smothers out the living plants. And when you're planting your plugs, you want to be careful to kind of plant right into your top layer and not pierce that, that cardboard underneath, because if you do, you can expose the mugwort seeds. Even if you do that, and you will do at least some, the amount that comes back becomes like spot pulling instead of like, oh my God, the entire field is mugwort. It works quite well for small to kind of medium sizes, and especially when you start working with those rolls of cardboard, you can kind of streamline it. If you start getting larger size, to smother on large size, cardboard becomes kind of untenable, and you end up having to go a different route, which is what we've tried this at Norcross. We work with something called silage tarps. This is like a standard tarp except on steroids. This is something that farmers use to protect silage. They generally come in sizes that are about 100 feet long and between 20 and 300 feet wide. So we're now talking something you can do acres with. I told you there's advantages and disadvantages to all these. You get to avoid the herbicide. This is a lot of single-use plastic. Maybe a few uses out of this plastic. If you kind of take care of it, you might be able to get away with using it one or two more times, but this is eventually a lot of plastic going into the, into the landfill. So it's not really just like a silver bullet against herbicides. It's something to just keep in mind if you decide, what am I trading off here? The final option, which actually works quite well for mugwort, is repeated tilling. Another downside, tilling soil is a pretty horrible thing to do to your soil. But if you've already got damaged soils, I think this is one of those instances, especially if at Norcross, my mugwort fields are old pastures with a history of tilling. So we make the argument that the ends justify the means, at least in certain places, and we'll do this repeated tilling method. You need to till the soil 3 to 4 times a year. And often you can usually get away with a single season, but you want to make sure the mugwort's done before you plant. So oftentimes we'll do it for a full season. We think the job's done, and we'll throw down, say, a smother crop, something like buckwheat the following season, confirm the mugwort's gone, and then plant in fall. Pluses and minuses to all these. Tilling's kind of nasty. Lots of plastic's kind of nasty. Cardboard is a potential source of PFAS, and herbicides have problems. So there's a pro and con to each one of these. But as I try and do with everything, I don't want to tell you what to do. I want to give you options. Decide what works for you. Do you have any other questions? Viva, you got any more in the chat?
Yes, we got one more question in the chat, and then I will say before I read that question, so many requests for that list of the edible plants. So
I will send that to you.
Dan, email that to us on staff, and we'll make sure that we include that in the follow-up. Looks like our last question in the chat is, I know of many lists of deer-resistant plants, but I don't know what research the lists are based on. What's your go-to?
So I can tell you one thing I've learned is deer and deer-resistant plants is definitely very regional. So what you want to do is find a list that is produced by someone who is generally local to your region. Cornell out of New York has a really decent list, which I find is a pretty good, accurate one for my region and for the general Northeast. I will also say that deer are opportunistic and selective. So you will find a plant that deer generally don't eat. If it's freshly planted, it's going through that transplant shock, it's under stress, the deer might eat it then. it's actually pretty common for that to happen. So you want to kind of, test this out a little bit. The other thing that I'll say is if you've got a plant like Pacra that I just saw pop up in a little pop-up, which is pretty darn deer resistant, and you've heard from me, that's deer resistant. Before you go out and plant 300 of them, maybe plant 5 or 10 in your garden. See how your deer respond to that plant. And assuming it is indeed deer resistant for you, then you can kind of move forward with planting much more of them. It's definitely not a silver bullet, but there is some value in surrounding deer, deer preferred plants with deer resistant plants. It is not an end all silver bullet, but it definitely will help to reduce deer browse. I think there's also something to be said for temporary deer fencing, temporary kind of deer protection to kind of get plants past the original, kind of get plants established. Because if you don't have huge amounts of deer browse, you might be able to get away with an established plant getting browsed every year and surviving and still doing just fine, but that same plant couldn't get established in those conditions. So that's where, kind of some small scale, kind of deer fencing can really help you out, at least to get things going at first. Deer are a challenge. If you actually read the Nature Conservancy put out a report that put deer as a greater threat to northeastern forests than climate change. Deer are at these huge levels, well above where they ought to be. We're out of balance, which is unfortunate. We tend to forget that, all right, let me ask the question and then I'll immediately answer it because I think it's an interesting question for everyone to ask. Think about this. Who's the major predator of deer? Who has been the major predator of deer for the past 30,000 years? It's not wolves. It's not bears. It's not the eastern puma. They were all part of it. It was humans. It's always been humans. It's been the indigenous folks of this region. And wolves are a pretty distant second on that list. So it makes you think about this kind of efficacy of hunting in a little bit of a different light, especially when you think about the value of, say, deer meat in my freezer versus the beef that we don't tend to treat our animals all that well in this country to a large extent. You can find well-raised animals, obviously. But I do tend to recommend hunting for ecological purposes. That doesn't help most people in suburbia. It's just not viable. But if you're in an area where you can hunt, it's an option. Not for everybody, but it's an option that's at least worth, deciding you don't want to do before you just immediately rule it out. But I got no silver bullets for deer. They are a major issue. We have them at Norcross in very high numbers. We do funny things to try and control them. We are now setting up a study where we are setting up speakers in our woods, playing the sound of people. The idea being that deer and humans have evolved as predator and prey for long enough that deer have an instinctual fear of humans. And it's not even people screaming at them. It's literally just people talking. It's got this lovely creep factor in the middle of our woods. You hear a whispered conversation that just like, what the hell? This is literally getting set up right now. So I have no idea if this will work, but there have been some similar studies that shows it might actually be very effective. So ask me in a year or 3, and I'll probably tell you you're going to need to talk to the sheriff lab that's going to publish the report before I go giving away their results. But that might actually be a viable method for people to do at home. Setting up speakers is not hard. Maybe. We don't know yet. No silver bullets on deer. It's a tough one. I'll solve deer the day I solve climate change.
Lovely close to that answer. Jeannie, I see you, but there was a question from the chat that I missed from Susan Landau, even before you finished your presentation. So Susan, if you're still here, sorry I missed it. This question is, the whole-scale landscaping trade sells non-native prunella, which is naturalized, quote unquote, all over and New Jersey and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Suggestions for reliably finding the native, and can you comment on Pacra obovata versus Aurea?
Sure. So I'm actually surprised to hear that prunella is being sold anywhere commonly. When as I started growing it, I have not found it available in the trade as the native or the non-native. You notice when I had the slide up, it was Prunella vulgaris subspecies lanceolata, and that subspecies is important. Lanceolata is our native American self-heal, and subspecies vulgaris is a European species, which has some history and medicinal value, and that might be, I think, I found that herbalists tend to know the plant before anyone else. This is a plant that is becoming more popular in my local landscape industry. I've seen it for sale at Garden in the Woods and Nasami Farm. I've seen it for sale at Blue Stem Natives. They're in Norwell, Mass. Phenomenal group of folks out there. I've seen seed available through Wild Seed Project now. It's one that when I was last talking to the Ernst Conservation Seed folks, they said they're planting out fields of it so they can produce pounds of seed. You know, we're getting, it's starting to hit the market. So it may not be available everywhere yet, but it is coming. Telling the two apart can be a little challenging if you don't know what you're looking for, but that lanceolata is referring to a lanceolate leaf. Our native one has this elongated leaf that appears kind of mid to later season, whereas the non-native one, the European one, has just a rounded leaf. And in the early season, they can look very, very similar. The native one is rounded early, and then it kind of elongates as the season progresses. So you kind of got to wait a little bit. That being said, the native plant, this is by no means uncommon on the landscape. It's very common. And granted, you know, depending on where you are, if you're sitting in an apartment in the middle of Boston, this might not help you. But this is a plant that if you're in even suburbia and getting into more rural areas, if you start looking for it, it's not hard to find. It's one that's very easy to collect seed on, and it's very easy to grow from seed. And then once you get a few going in your garden, it's an even easier collection. I highly recommend working with iNaturalist. Really good website and app that can help you to find plants on the landscape as well as identify plants on the landscape. And assuming you're in an area where you can collect seeds, so that means, you know, asking permission or being in an area where it's allowed, it's not a hard plant to find if you're looking for it. But I think it's one that is going to be showing up on the landscape industry much more regularly in the future. And in terms of the Pacra, so we've got Pacra obovata, the running groundsel, and Pacra aurea, which I usually just heard called golden groundsel. I find obovata spreads more quickly, but is less thuggish than aurea, which might spread a little bit more slowly, but really, like, when it spreads, that area is Pacra aureas. So I use Pacra aurea often as a planting in areas with you know, a previous history of either agricultural weeds or invasive species. Once it gets established, it tends to take the space. So if we were talking, you know, earlier about some mugwort, and you got a patch of mugwort and you're looking to replant the area afterwards, Pacra aurea is a good option. If you're looking for a living mulch, I would recommend obovata because it spreads more quickly and works better with other species. Okay, and I think we had at least one more question. Let's take one or two more questions and then maybe call it a night. What do we got?
Sounds like a good deal. Yeah. Jeannie, go ahead. Come off of mute and let us know what you got.
I did it. Yes, in urban areas, cities with small yards, at least in the Northeast, at least in the general Boston area, rabbits are overwhelming. I beg for coyotes to come in, as do many other people, and I think there should be hunting season. But I won't mention that. It seems like there are fewer rabbits, except that they wiped out an aster that was my grandmother's that they never ate for 10 years. They were not eating this thing. And then they ate them down to 2 inches throughout my yard in scattered areas. You just need a predator, I guess. There's nothing you can do about them, correct? They make babies, and the babies, you know, the bunnies are cute, but
I mean, yes, they make babies. They eat a lot. They generally don't eat asters. So the fact that you saw them eating asters meant it was a thin year for them, and they were eating things that they normally don't eat. So, you know, working with species that they normally don't eat is at least going to get you a little bit kind of better off than species that they regularly eat. Look towards the mint family. It's often a very good one for herbivory resistance. So the mountain mints are phenomenal. Yes. The pea bombs, the skull caps, these are great plants. The mountain mints especially are very, very fragrant, and I found that you can plant. We try and plant lilies at Norcross, and we surround them in mountain mint because lilies are deer candy and rabbit candy. But you know, when they're surrounded by a dense planting of, say, broadleaf mountain mint, they've got a much better chance of surviving. There's also the instance, like you described, of those asters. If you see them eating stuff they don't normally eat, that's if you can respond to that, if you get the chance to, you know, throw some caging in there for that season. It's not something you're necessarily going to have to do every year, but especially if you've got like the prized, you know, aster that you know is the family heirloom, you know, you might be able to kind of get away with some temporary sort of stuff that you might not want to do every year. There's the idea of repellents, which are kind of hit or miss, but one thing that makes them a little bit more effective is if you every couple of years change brands. The
Yeah.
rabbits and the deer respond to patterns. So if you're using, say, Bobex every year, then eventually the deer realize it just smells bad. It doesn't mean anything. Switch over to deer fence or liquid fence or whatever it is and kind of switch
Mhm.
around a little bit, and you'll find they become a little bit more effective.
Mhm.
And as soon as that effectivity goes, you can kind of kick into a different one. Something else that I've used that may or may not work depending on, your space is a motion activated sprinkler. It actually worked quite well for us for a little while. Orbit makes them. They're not great, but they're pretty good. It's kind of hilarious to see, we were watching deer. We put up a wildlife cam and the deer would come in and the motion activated, then they'd run off.
Mhm.
Again, they respond to patterns. So, the first year the deer left all our plants alone. The second year they ate some of them. By the third year, we had no plants in wet deer. But if you can kind of keep switching things up, like a repellent, maybe a speaker, maybe kind of keep it moving, and that'll be more effective. And encourage your neighbors to plant hostas, because they love the hostas and they'll go to their neighbors.
Oh my God. Well, that's not for rabbits, but yeah, at first they only ate Astrolavis. But this time it's not even a native plant, for heaven's sake, but they were eating it. And at first I was using mothballs in a prescription bottle tilted toward the ground so it wouldn't evaporate or get in the soil. And that kept them away if I could do it plant by plant, which is really hard. They got my Linarifolia over and over again.
Those repellents might be a better option than the mothballs. They're a lot easier to, kind of distribute on the landscape.
Yeah.
And they might be a little bit more effective than having to go plant by plant, but they're not, again, no silver bullets here.
Yeah.
Throw the whole kitchen sink at it and it will never solve the problem, but it will improve things.
Yeah. The mints do work. That's why I have a whole
more bee
yard
balm.
of mint.
Nothing wrong with more bee balm.
More bee balm, but even the spearmint and the peppermint, nothing touched that area at all. So it's thick now, but it's easy to pull up. So I don't care. And I dry it anyway.
You find what works for you.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. Aviva, do we have a last question or should we call that the end?
I think that's the end. Yeah. All
Okay.
of the chat was recorded with the rest of the presentation. So if we didn't get to anybody else's, we can get to it through email. Dan, thanks for staying late. And everybody else who's still with us, thank you all for staying late. And if I may echo everybody in the chat, thank you so much, Dan, for a fantastic presentation. You are one of the best presenters and speakers I have seen in my short years of living.
Oh, shucks. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Fill out the survey and get to know ELA. We're a fantastic organization.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And enjoy the rest of your night. Hope you have a great weekend. Hope we're seeing some people at Greenwood Cemetery and hope to see even more at Seasons End Summit next week. Have a good one.
I'll see you there. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.